not only to see you again, but to sort of visit new places. So just as a check, I know most of you, but are you, what is your background? Are you students in linguistics or?
Yes.
Okay, and like also, you also? Okay, cool. So just getting a sense of audience. So, okay, so today I'm talking about aspect. A disclaimer ahead of time that if there's anything that's, well, there will be many things that I'm trying to cover today, and so there may be things that you can ask about in questions. I will be giving sort of a whirlwind tour of a number of ideas. So I hope that it'll go at a pace that's suitable here. Okay, so for those of you who don't have any background in, let's see, is this working? No? One second, I thought it was working. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so this is just to give the background, just in case people don't have some experience with tense and aspect especially. So the idea, very, very cartoon-like literally here, is that sentences here, like Harry walked to the cafe, and Harry is walking to the cafe with this great artwork here, can be understood as differing in some important respects. Okay, so more cartoonish activity supposedly coming. So, okay, so in this case, there is this person, Harry, who's making a motion from one place to another, and you know that it takes place some time before speech time, and you know that he does reach the goal as part of the event, and you know that you're somehow talking about the entire event. And in contrast, Harry is walking, marked progressive tense here. It sort of has a very similar event, actually, but instead of depicting the entire event, he's somehow on this path, on the way there. And moving along, so this is a little dynamic representation. So it's happening as we're speaking, it's true right now. The goal hasn't been reached. If you ask, is he at the cafe or not? He is not. And somehow you're looking at a more focused part. So another sort of way of depicting this might be that in one case you have an event looked at as a whole, think of this as a little timeline, and that you're sort of saying, okay, this motion happened, and he wasn't at the cafe, and now he is. And in this case, maybe there's a motion, and you're focusing on one little part of it. Okay, so this is just to get everyone on the same page, that the point is that we know that difference because of something about the grammar, something about those sentences we saw. They're differing in this important way. Okay, so in fact, you can do other things. You can focus, this is all different ways. This is just a way of drawing how you can represent different ways of looking at a scene. So you might be focusing on part of the event here. Maybe you're saying that it's bounded in a certain way. Maybe you're focusing on the beginning. So in English, we have various ways of saying this that will come up when I flip through. So for example, this might be is walking. Maybe he walked for a minute, then you know exactly took place, it started and ended. You could start walking. You can have, I have walked. It means I'm somewhere after done with my walking action, and I can finish walking. So all of these things, although some of them are strictly grammar, like a tense marking, and some of them are some other kind of construction, start walking, finish walking, there are ways of focusing attention for the viewer and the hearer of the sentence on some part of the event. And different languages, I won't go into detail here because I'm not a native speaker of Russian, might use different devices to focus your attention. So for example, in Russian, there are different kinds of prefixes that tell you for some verb here, which I thought I had translated, I think it's also walking, that also tell you which part to focus on. So they're not exactly the equivalent from one language to another, and they might not mean exactly the same thing, but they can do the same kinds of operations. Focus my attention at the beginning, the end, some other aspect. In Chinese, for example, you have it's similar to the English case where you might have a phrase 正在做, which is I'm in the middle of walking, process of walking. And you can say things other ways. This is start walking, basically, 开始 start, and so on. So the point here is that the function of focusing attention on some part of an event can happen in different ways in different languages. And in fact, I will give you a few examples. And it's not just the phase, it's not just where in the event you are. You can also talk about, is it happening once or is it happening many times? If I say, I sneezed, how many times I sneezed? Just once, right? And if I said, oh, well, I was sneezing all morning, that's probably more than one sneeze, right? If I ask you how many sneezes, probably at least 5, more like 10 or 15, who knows, depends on your allergy state. Okay, you have this idea of telicity, which is just the idea that there may be a well-defined goal or endpoint or result. So if I say, oh, I walked, or I was walking, versus I walked to the park. I had a very directed goal that morning. I wanted to get to the park. Read versus read a book. So read a book, if I say I read a book, you know that what page was I on? Probably not on page 1, unless I was reading backwards, right? I was at the end of the book. Whereas read, you're sort of reading around anywhere, okay? And you might also say something about how long you were doing something. For walk for 5 hours is a different kind of boundary on it. Okay, so these are some of the kinds of things that aspectual constructions, aspectual markers can tell you. Okay, so, well, 3 dots there so you know there are many, many more. Okay. So this is not so straightforward as you may expect. For example, some nice examples, I'm going to focus on English for most of the talk. The sentence here, Mary read the book for 5 hours. Okay, she read, was she done or not? It's a question. If I read the book for 5 hours, I don't think you can conclude that I'm done. But if I read the book in 5 hours, okay, well, it wasn't that long a book, but you definitely finished the book, right? So you can draw this inference of completion. I attained my goal. Barry stood for 5 minutes. So then you might ask a question like, well, what happened after that? He could have kept standing, or maybe he sat down. Maybe it's slightly more likely that he sat down. Barry swam for 5 minutes, okay, so that's fine. And each of these is sort of one event that lasted that amount of time. But Barry sneezed for 5 minutes, again, as I said before, it's probably multiple events. It wasn't one sneeze that lasted extremely, extremely long time. You're like, you know, it could be a long time, but it's less likely, right? And so Gary swam, left for 5 minutes. It's interesting because, again, the swimming event takes 5 minutes in one. But the interesting thing with Gary left for 5 minutes is not that he was like packing his bag and losing things and it took 5 minutes to get out the door. It's that he left and the time was 5 minutes before, most likely, he then came back. So it's right, I left for the period of 5 minutes, right? It's the time afterwards. So they have very different kinds of semantics, even though it's exactly the same syntactic construct, looks like the same construction, right? And then Terry left in 5 minutes. That's a little bit more like the leaving happened at the end, and 4 or 5 minutes is the one we said before. So the point is you should get the idea that things that look the same have very different shape, right? This idea that events have different kinds of shapes and different things that are true, and this idea of reversibility is sort of funny, right? I unlocked the door for 5 minutes. It's a little weird, right? Okay, so then it gets even more complicated when you start going with, let's say, borderline cases and things that have the linguistic question mark. Like, can I really say Terry went to the mall for 5 hours? Fine. He went to the mall, he stayed there, he left after 5 hours. Terry went to the mall in 5 hours. It's a little weird. I mean, do you guys get it? I mean, for the native speakers here, it's a little weird. Maybe you have to have been talking about a particular time and then in 5 hours from that point. So it's, for a native speaker, it's strange. Larry ate sandwiches for 5 minutes. Okay, there's this whole pile of sandwiches and he's in a contest or something. Larry ate a sandwich for 5 minutes. I get a little strange because you feel like you're not supposed to have finished it, but he said a sandwich. So you get these conflicts between wanting the event to be finished when you talk about how much time there is, and knowing that it's either unbounded because it's sort of a mass of sandwiches, or just one. So, and then similarly, Carrie washed the cart in 5 minutes. Fine. She started washing. She finished. The car is clean. Carrie pushed the car in 5 minutes has that same weirdness where you want something to have been finished or something to be okay. And then I like these. So Perry is being totally ridiculous versus Perry is totally ridiculous has different implications for, I guess, what you think Perry is normally like. Is he always this way? He just is a ridiculous person? Or is he right now being a ridiculous person? So these are the kinds of things, even though they go beyond grammatical tense and aspect, it really does affect how you interpret what the speaker is saying. So is everyone, I mean, is this really easy? Like most of you maybe have seen some of these kinds of things before? Okay. But maybe not these fun English examples. So, okay, so these are the kinds of semantics that we would like to be represented. If we want to understand not just what sentences deserve a question mark or a star, but really what can you conclude? What do you mean by that? What can you infer? Then you have to think about how to represent all these vectors. Okay, so the goal of today's talk, is there a clock somewhere? I just realized, anyway, is to try to describe some of the basic semantic and conceptual structures we need, and linguistic, of course, we'll get to represent these kinds of things. How do we deal with this? And in particular, how do we try to account for the patterns that we just saw? Why are some things okay and some things weird, and what do they mean? And the structure of the talk will be, first I'll talk about the approach that we're basically taking, this idea of embodied simulation semantics. I'll explain what I mean by that. Then I'll give you at least a glimpse, not overly technical, of what machinery you actually need to do to make this theory come alive, okay? And then a brief section at the end where I sort of talk about what does this buy you. If you have this, then where can you go with it if it works? Okay, so first section, embodiment. Big keyword in cognitive linguistics. But before that, going historically, actually the study of aspect, I would say, is actually still dominated by this classification that happened by Zeno Bendler quite some time ago, saying that you could look at predicates, kinds of actions and events, and class them into different categories. So for example, a state, and here I'm just drawing a line to say there's no change. Like the examples are know and resemble. Okay, if I know something, I know it, or I don't know it, nothing's changing, I just know. Okay, it's true. Or I resemble. This is true. Like, you know, Barcelona, you know, resembles San Francisco. Well, it may or may not be true, but okay, so that's a state thing that doesn't change. Okay, activities, running, swimming, the kinds of things you would think are like, okay, I'm running a lot and taking many steps, something that has a process and moves along in time. There's some change, but you're sort of doing some kind of continuous activity. Accomplishment, that's this idea that you're moving toward a goal. You're writing a letter, you're running a mile, there's some endpoint, it's T-Lick, right? And achievement is sort of like, okay, there's some state that was true and then it's not true, or it wasn't true and that something happens and it sort of is a sort of instant in time in a way. So I find these categories a little bit funny, but you can think of it as, okay, if it's sort of you can think of it as one single thing. Sneeze, actually, you haven't really achieved much at that point except for the lack of desire to sneeze anymore, but recognize is sort of, okay, so it's this point-like event. Anyway, the point is these were the classifications, and they're useful for a lot of things. Like you can then sort of say, well, actually there's some structure here. You know, some things they have no change, like stated things, and some things do have change, they're dynamic. Are they atypic, like no goal, or they have a goal? Do they take a long time? Like this would also be protracted, and this anticipated. So you can see, these are lots of words on the screen. And the idea is people started putting their own words for it. Every language has its own things that it cares about, and people started seeing that, oh, well, the theory's not quite rich enough, well, let me throw in some more terms. So you may, if you have studied any other aspectual work, you may hear terms like imperfective, perfective, bounded, durative, punctual, unbounded. I sort of threw them there relatively near where they're often defined. And I say this kind of vaguely because honestly the field of aspectology is full of terminology and people all use their terms in slightly different ways. And so for some of them they're binary features, it's true or false. Some of them there's some inheritance thing going on, some of them they're some kind of scale. So the point is that it clearly indicates at the very least is a very rich topic, full of potential disagreement and let's hope eventual consensus, but we'll see about that. Okay. So what do we do with all of this? I mean, we can't just invent more and more labels that we use as categories. Okay, so the idea of embodiment here, if you can't read it here, this is, for those of you who don't know, this is Gary Larson, a very important American cultural icon here, but this is pull, and if you know the meaning of pull, then you will know that he definitely does not deserve to be at the Midvale School for the Gifted. So something about the meaning of pull, you know if you perform this action, but I guess in Spanish, what is it? I mean, know the word in Spanish. Tirar. Tirar, okay, so tirar in French is something like this, is toward you, and he's doing something that's obviously very much not like that. So incorporating at least something about motion and motor action might be a clue to the kinds of things that come up that we want to care about. Okay? And not just something like direction. You could say direction toward, direction against, but actually when you look at pictures of people performing actions, I'm going to pick up this ball. Well, I'm moving toward it in a certain way, but my hand is already shaking because I know it's a ball shape. If I were picking up my cup, I might go like this. There are different, if I were picking up paper, I might be like this. So the point is that things are happening at the same time. It's very rich. You know how much force to exert. If I picked up a very delicate thing with much force, I would break it, which I actually often do because I'm very clumsy. But you need to know that much experience in the world gives you the knowledge to perform these tasks. Okay, so if you are taking the idea that actions and events in the world involve knowledge of this kind, so you would know if you're performing an action. If I said, okay, knock on the door, you probably will not go up and go like this. Right, so for most of us, you have to do at least a couple times, and so it's sort of the fact that it's repeated, or maybe it happens in periodic intervals, like a phone ringing is going to happen and then happen again, right? Those are part of what you know about what happens in the world. And the same thing that you know that certain actions require a sequence of activities, things that happen at the same time, branching paths. So this is just sort of a laundry list of not what you would expect from necessarily studying linguistics books, but from what you know about controlling actions in the world. If someone says, go run a mile tomorrow, you know that go run to the store means you have a goal. Until you are at the store, you should keep running, right? So, I mean, if you obey this person who has control here. So, and then also the fact that you're running and then, you trip on something and you're falling, that's an interrupt. So what do? You can't really keep running then. You have to do something else. You have to now try not to fall down. And then when you regain your balance, you may resume. So these are the kinds of things that running involves many steps and sort of conditional triggering of other kinds of things you might do. And also, very importantly, when you're running, you're using up your energy, you're getting more and more tired, maybe you'll not be able to continue after a while. When you're creating and using up objects, right? So if I write a book, now at the end of that time, there's a new thing in the world, and this book exists, right? So this resource has been created. Okay, so the point is that if you look at what we need to know in order to deal with the world, there's a lot more going on there than traditionally appears in the aspectual classes, okay? Okay, so this sort of leads to the grand hypothesis, not so grand, about what language understanding entails. So here's the idea, simulation. We understand utterances by mentally simulating their content. So what does that mean? That means that something about what we know about walking, moving one foot in front of the other, using energy, perceiving, all these things, some of those structures are connected to language, connected to the structures that are used when we are understanding a sentence about it, right? So if I keep saying I'm running to the store, something about your knowledge of running, tripping, falling, hunger, buying, purchasing, these frames that are activated is somehow part of your understanding. And it could be a relatively shallow level, or you might actually be sort of drawing many deep inferences about it, but either way you're using these structures, okay? And what language doesn't necessarily directly, it consists of those neural structures, not just that. There's, of course, more structure that we know. All the studies of grammar, the patterns that we've picked up. But at least it somehow evokes and taps into and uses those other structures, and then you know what kind of thing you're talking about, and then you can use those structures and draw inferences about likelihood of falling down, or likelihood of falling asleep, or that kind of thing. Okay? So feel free to ask questions if something is unclear, especially if I'm going fast. Okay. Okay. So here's the same slide in picture form. When you hear a sentence like Harry walked to the cafe, the idea is you do something, and I'm not going to talk too much about what this is that you do some processing. And this is a very simplified version of at least the end of this, knowing English and knowing the sentence, you know that the person who's walking, the trajector, is Harry. You know that walking is the kind of action he's performing, and you know that he ends up at this place, the cafe. Okay? You may know other things, but this is sort of the basic outlook. Okay, and then from there, you can then do this thing that's thrown as the picture here, which is the actual simulation, which is, okay, wow, that's involving legs iterating and moving toward this goal and that kind of thing. So it's sort of a two-stage process here, simplified, to give you the idea that language does some setting up, this parameterization or specification of basically what structures do I need to activate, and then put them together in the following way, and then you understand lots of other stuff. And what did you need? You needed, okay, linguistic knowledge, however, we will talk about what that is later. You need general knowledge, what's a cafe? What's walking? what is Harry? Who is Harry? Which Harry? I may know 5 of them. I have to figure out who it is. And maybe belief state, maybe I know that Harry is a dog. So when Harry walked to the cafe, what's a different kind of motion now than what you pictured before? And if it's a particular kind of dog, it might be really slow or fast or so. Okay, so here, there's another pictorial representation. So when I said here is a big, massive stuff, so more formally, the massive stuff amounts to dynamic representations here, and this is just a graphical depiction of a way of representing here the action of walking. Okay, so walking could be more complicated than this, but at least you might have various ways of representing stages. So you stare at it for a second, and you can see, for example, that there's sort of a flow of direction here. that maybe there are some conditions, like you have to be able, well, you don't have to be able to see, but let's say in this case, there's some visual or sensory cue that walking is a safe thing to do at this point, and you're probably standing upright unless you're a dog. And then something like you need a certain amount of energy to start the process. Maybe we're talking about, this dot here represents also that we're in the stage of being in the middle of walking. There are different steps. The walk has a stepping action on one foot and a stepping action on another foot. And I can go into more detail about this if you're interested, but I just want to get you the idea that this is not just a picture that we draw to make ourselves understand. It actually is an active thing that you can use to explain to someone, really, it's a program for this is how you might do walking, right? And not only that, it could be that right now I didn't draw it, but I throw in a boulder into your path, okay? And then at that point you might end up, instead of continuing walking, you might go off and start stumbling, and what would you do? Or this here says the goal for walking here is to be at the store. And so don't worry about the definition, but this is sort of like, keep walking, this is inhibition. Keep walking and you can finish when you've arrived at the store. So I'll show you in the next slide a little bit more, but the idea is just that this is a structure that you say something to do walking, and you might say something like how fast, is slow, and the goal is the store. And there are various ways of interpreting that, all the different pieces of it. But it should give you a detailed sense of what it means to really know what it is to walk. If you've reflected upon it or watched a toddler trying to master this, and this doesn't have lots of other parts of it. Okay, so to go one level deeper, I won't go more than this probably on what this looks like. The basic idea is that this graph has circles and rectangles. The circles represent either a resource, like I need energy. Okay, I need at least, here there's a number like, okay, I have 3 units of energy, and to take one step I need 2 units to go, right? So things like that. If I don't have enough energy, then I'm not going to be able to do this, okay? Another step is precondition, like again, I have to have legs, for example, right? So, or I have to have a clear path, okay? And then inhibition, like this will stop me from doing it if something is there. Okay, so this idea that there are various ways that you can sort of affect an action, and then if all the ways are satisfied, like my preconditions are fine and nothing's stopping me, I can fire. And that means I can, okay, go ahead and do this thing, and the result might be, okay, well now I've moved and my position has changed and now I'm less energetic or whatever it is. So this is this little, think of it as a building block, and with this you can sort of piece together bigger structures that create the thing that we saw on the previous slide, the walking. Okay, so the idea now, as I said, so now this structure that is similar to what we saw, is that this formalism, which is called executing schema, or XNet, if there's if you're interested in computationally, ask me afterward. The idea is that you can really use this to talk about what walking means. Okay, so you can say who the walker is. Okay, the walker is Harry, where he's going, the fact that he needs energy over there, sort of appeared, okay, the fact that he has a goal, the fact that it's currently ongoing as opposed to just finished, right? All the things that we said aspectual marking can do. If I say I started walking, then that means I just finished this one. I just triggered the beginning of the walk. Okay, so this is a non-linguistic way of talking about what you know in order to walk to the store, what you need to know, something like this, right? And the linguistic version is, all we need to say is that different constructions, and we'll come back to what that is, some pieces of language can say, okay, I want walking to happen, that's the one I want. I want Harry, see, so Harry's walking home here. Oops, let me go back there. Like, let's say the subject might specify who's doing the action, the verb might say which action they're performing. Is walking obviously is saying I'm somewhere in the middle, and home is saying where. So this is, you can sort of see that it's mapping onto different pieces of the picture. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so then if you start looking at more than just walking, running, swimming, all these other things, you can start to see a similar structure across some of them. So for example, maybe lots of different actions have a possibility of interruption and suspension or resistance, and that they start and finish and abort. So these are sort of standard stages that you could talk about. Not for every kind of thing, but for many, many kinds of processes, right? And they may or may not have a goal, right? So this is the idea that this has a lot of the general framework for action control. And the question is, maybe this is useful for linguistic representation as well. Or that's the claim, okay? So for example, something called, if you have in your language a special morpheme that says, this means I'm starting the action, right? This morpheme in front of the word for walk means starting to walk. Well, maybe that somehow points directly there, like I said, or maybe it points at the resume, right? Because there are ways of marking these things. So again, you get the idea that this provides something for language to grab onto and say, I want that part of it. Okay, so now I'm going to flash through a bunch of pictures, and the goal of this is just to give you a sense that we can represent lots of different interesting semantics, right? So in English, it might not even be a grammatical thing. In this case, it's the lexicalized, the word stumble. What does the word stumble mean? You can't know what stumbling is unless you know what walking or motion is. So somehow this sort of network for walking, it directly is this idea of interruption, right? Stumble, so you all know stumble is if I trip and I almost fall down, that's exactly stumble. So now I've provided the meaning in a very, very direct way. And similar to the idea of frame that and other things that you'll hear more about probably from Michael tomorrow, the idea is you can't know what that is unless you know it's defined in terms of other stuff. You need the idea of motion in general and this sort of general process in order to understand stumble. Okay. Okay, now here's a bunch of sentences. Again, there's just an idea of what it means. Harry is about to walk to the cafe. That should be pretty clear. It's in the ready stage. Harry is walking to the cafe, sort of in the middle there somewhere before. Harry has walked to the cafe. So these are different phrases. I mean, in this case, it's actually perfect tense. The other one's progressive. The previous one was sort of the is ready to or whatever. So all these different kinds of ways of saying something in language, whether it's strictly grammatical or something that's more lexicalized, have their home here. They have a common semantic representation. Okay, and so then you can start imagining that you can put these together into more complex events, right? So I should have had you guess a sentence that would correspond to this, but here, let's say, they are getting ready to continue their journey across the desert. Okay, so they are getting ready, let's see, so there's a journey across the desert that's going on here, and continue, that means that they had been interrupted and they want to resume it, okay? So they want to continue, but they're getting ready to do this. So these dotted lines are like, oh, that itself, resuming is itself an action, right? It's something you can do, and it can have stages also. You can be ready to do it, or in the process of doing it, or finishing doing it. So you can see that if you start putting together these bits of action control, then you can get very complex situations in the sort of the same representation. Is that good? So this is the maybe the big idea here is if you don't get anything else, this is the part that says the semantics of complex aspectual constructions and complex sentences is, let's say, well captured by a representation that is motivated by aspects of motor control. Yes? Okay, good. Okay, so the interim summary. What I just said, we hope that this idea of simulation, the semantics, is a rich embodied basis, and that very fine-grained aspectual distinctions, right? Things like the energy and exactly what stage and conditions and goals can be very naturally captured in the simulation. And not only do you see, you can just draw the picture and put like a circle there or something like that, but you can sort of say, well, what happens next? What's likely to happen next if I continue the scenario? If I say Harry was walking to the store, given no other information, you might say, oh, well, probably he got to the store, right? So you can start doing things that are more than just describing the sort of, quote, pure semantics of a sentence. You can actually start understanding and predicting and doing all the things that people actually do when they're listening to sentences too. Okay, so we've said what the meanings should look like, something like that, but we haven't said how you get to that point. How do you get these nice little pictures? And I'll try to give at least a sketch of what that would be like. So, any questions at this point, sort of interim? Okay. Okay, so this is the second part, it's good. So I'll give you an idea of what the sort of the theory of the linguistic input is. Okay, so going back to this picture, you saw this already, right? So we said language understanding, there's some process and it uses some stuff. So I'm trying in this section to, I'm not going to demystify this much, the some process, but the some stuff, I'll try to tell you what some stuff means a little better. Okay, so are you familiar with embodying what sort of, I guess, cognitive linguistics at all? Frame semantics, possibly? Yes? Okay, well, as a summary, in cognitive linguistics, it's a very sort of powerful idea that a lot of concepts are embodied, right? That recurrent experiences like motion along a path, in this case, the idea that there could be a source, a path, a goal, and something that moves along the path. This happens everywhere. Your child, they're always moving the cookie to their mouth or throwing the ball to the ground. So from a very early age, many, many things are conceptualized as movement, right? And similarly here, many things, and there are pictures here just to show, but that containment, right? Like the milk is in the bottle, we're in the room, right? So this room looks very different from a bottle, but they're very similar at an abstract, generalized level, right? Okay, and so, but what they have in common is you can talk about it, there are some kind of boundary and portals and exteriors. So, again, not focusing on the notation, but the idea that many things, and in particular those things that are important in language, have these image schemas at the heart of them. So I guess that is part of what we're tapping into. When we want to talk about the meaning of something, often the meaning will involve some set of these sort of abstracted, they're not abstract in the sense that they are lacking, they are, let's see, they were motivated from something very experientially grounded, right? So there are common patterns over these experiences. Okay, so assuming we have those floating around as well as something like the schemas we saw before, the idea is maybe those aspectual representations that we saw pictures of before also can be thought of as abstract experiences in the sense that that's controller structure, start, beginning, end. That's a very common motor pattern. And so we can also say it's a kind of frame, right? So these things look like frame schemas. These terms are used often in the same way. It's the idea that the concept of container is defined by, they're interdefined by all these rules, right? It's hard to talk about interior without knowing what exterior is. All these things are a gestalt that come together. So similarly, if I say, oh, he started doing something, you can't know what start means unless you know that there are things that have beginnings and ends and there is an ending, right? Okay, so the idea is that these interdefined concepts are important and they are also appropriate for the idea of event structure here. And that profiling, this term is also meant to use highlighting, okay? So if I'm profiling, I started doing something, then I'm focusing attention again on that part. It's like the way the common example is hypotenuse, this idea from geometry, the right triangle. What is hypotenuse? You only know it as part of the right triangle. It has to be defined that way, and it's highlighting that part. Okay, so the important thing here is that all the meanings we were talking about before have this structure, that maybe they also have these sort of roles that you can get at and recur over and over again. Okay, so here is one way of representing a mass of stuff that might be present if you want to control an action, right? So just reminding you that there is this active structure, but if you want language to be able to grab onto different parts of it, you want to name some of these structures. And this is not necessarily exactly the final perfect list, but maybe you want to talk about the profiled or highlighted phase. Maybe you want to talk about if there's a controlled process, right? If this is controlling the process of walking, for example, which actual action are you doing? Is it boundable? And we can talk, so it's like, could it have an end? Some things couldn't, right? And some things could. So T-Link, does it have a goal? Is there a result of the goal? These are trying to remind you of the weird sentences we saw before and the kinds of inferences that you could draw or not, right? And that there might be a sort of like state beforehand or afterward duration. So don't focus on all those things. It's just the idea that you can sort of see these complex controllers as having this structure. That to talk about this whole event, you need to sort of schematize it in a way and see it as, again, just like other frames and other semantic schemas, with something with rules. Okay, so it's not just the complex controller we saw here. So one sort of side point I'll make is that when we start talking about aspectual classes, the traditional ones, state of, activity, etc., they weren't totally wrong. I mean, there's definitely something important that's different about states, and sneezing and knowing are very different in various ways, right? So you can also think of it as, here's another division, a categorization that maybe with states, in this notation, you just draw a circle, okay? So it's a state that's true or not. Remember I know something or I don't know something. It resembles or it doesn't resemble, right? Process, that's the one we've been talking about along the sort of standard walking, running, sneezing, etc. But it would be an accomplishment if you have a clear goal that you're moving toward, like walking to the store. Would still use a structure, but you put something onto it. Actually, I think I have examples now I think about it. Yes. So here they are, live and have, these are sort of the state-like things. And interestingly, you can take that and modify it and say something like, oh, sorry, these are the examples. So live and have, run and swim, and then this last one, sneeze. Sneeze is like before I'm sitting there and then something happens, with sneezing, and then afterward I have sneezed, right? Same thing with leaving and winning, but they have something similar, right? There's a before and an after, but they differ in other respects. So we'll get to that in a second, but for all of these you can also add on things like a duration, right? If I just say I live in Paris, which is true, you don't know anything about have I always lived there, am I always going to live there? It's just a true statement now with no bounds. But if I say I live there, I'm living there this year, or for now, then you suddenly have a glimpse of the beginning and end. Similarly, I can actually give the duration, I'm living there for 6 months or something, right? And then this one, if I put it here, it's very natural. I was walking, for 5 hours, and after 5 hours, only then did I finish, right? Okay, and then this red is to show that leave is sort of different from sneeze and win, and that really changes the situation, right? Sneeze generally doesn't change the situation in any important way, but leaving, you're there, and then you weren't there, right? So they have these same structure, but different effects. So, okay, and you can also add this for an hour. So you can see that this little idea that the adding a time phrase, like for an hour, here it says that actually for leave, you might be measuring how long the effect lasts. So this graph is sort of trying to give an idea that even though this is the same idea that you're trying to take an interval and give a measure to it, like how long it was, it does different things in all the different cases because what they're acting on is actually different underneath. Does that make sense? Okay, so the idea is that you can't just have one aspectual control for everything. Really, there are different kinds that are specific, and each of them has appropriate kinds of rules that apply to it and constraints on the rules that come from the general idea. Okay, so moving on now so that was covering kind of what components you need to represent the meanings that matter, that we're bringing it closer to a framing semantic way of looking at the meanings of aspectual stuff. How do we get to language? Where are the words? Where are the syntax bits? Where's all that? Okay, so for that, construction grammar is there anyone familiar a little bit? Yes? Some? Okay, well, I'll give you the summary. So an approach to the representation of linguistic units is that instead of the traditional division from, sort of phonology and syntax and all these other things are separate, instead everything, words, idioms, larger bits, sentences, they're all pairings of form on the one hand and meaning on the other. And let me give you some examples. Form is usually a spoken or gestural or written thing, like the word pug. So perhaps you don't all know what a pug is, but now you do, because I'm telling you that is the meaning associated with the word pug is this kind of adorable dog. And then the meaning of the word toward, I'm just drawing an arrow here just to be schematic, but that something about moving from one point to another is part of the meaning, right? So it's even though so the first one is sort of a common noun, the second one is a preposition, but it still has meaning that has motion. Big Bird, do you all know Big Bird? Yes, Sesame Street, okay. I don't know how to say it, but anyway, so the big bird is this guy. So the important thing is it has two words on the other side, but it can still point to a very clear, unique individual. And then this last one, a lot of kids say things like, throw it. And they may or may not know that there's two words there. They may or may not have an it or a pronoun, but okay, they know that they're doing this thing and it's that thing that they're playing with, okay? So the idea is all of these are mini constructions. So I work on child language too, which is why I have examples like this. But the idea, and this is just to give you a high-level view, is that whether it's a very simple word connected to a very simple image, kind of simple, it's just sort of that's one construction. This one is a more complex relational idea of motion, of something, but it's still a word paired with that thing. There's like two words and it's paired to this. So the idea is there is just a mapping across these two domains at different levels of complexity. And you're asking, well, where's the syntax? You can do that as well. So here's just an idea. Well, so here is, for example, the ones we just saw, you might represent in some way. Again, I won't necessarily go into the formalism, but if you want to write down this sort of graphical, these sort of graphical representations in some way that you can then look at, analyze, perhaps implement, there's a notation that we developed that just says construction, like the word for you might say orthography, Y-O-U, and the meaning is you know that an addressee is someone who's listening to you, right? You guys are my addressee right now. Throwing is this action of throw, and when I write this, meaning throw, that means somewhere I know a lot about throwing, involving like arms and force and all those things, and this is just a pointer to it. It's just like a tag, okay, go look at that thing, right? So this is not just a symbol, it's sort of pointing at some other representation or action. And then ball is this idea of ball. So we can write these things very simply. Slightly more complicated is when you start putting these little units together, and the graphical version of that, don't worry too much, but just to say that you might have two words, and importantly, they're in a certain order. For some languages that matters, in other languages, maybe you'd have case marking or some other way of saying how these fit together. We have to agree, something like that. And in this section, the meaning is a whole scene. It's not just throwing a ball together, it's he is doing the throwing and the ball is being thrown and it's going in maybe in some direction, right? It's a whole scene that's packaged in a way. And similarly, the larger unit somehow makes use of these lower mappings that you already knew, right? That you have as lexical items, and then it sort of puts them together in a way. And then you have some way of writing it down. Like the exact details, not so important, but it says, I know that the word throw can come before the word ball, right? They come before, and they mean that the thrown thing, the throwee, is this. So don't worry, but you can definitely ask if you're interested, but the idea, I'm writing down the idea that a certain set of relations here comes with certain relations in the form, word order for English, and something else for other languages. Okay, so that's like the 3-minute overview of construction grammar, and if you haven't had, if you want to learn more, there's much more literature out there. So, okay, so coming back to aspect, you should be able to predict now that I'm going to say, okay, well maybe aspectual constructions and morphemes or words or whatever it is that's talking about aspect can be written down the same way. So remember this familiar old friend here, the progressive construction that maybe says, when you hear ing, even if if I said, oh, he was xing, I don't know what x is, I didn't tell you what x is, but you know that whatever it was, something was happening and it was ongoing, it had some duration, and this mysterious thing, at least you're evoking some abstract activity. The claim is something like the word, like, don't worry about the notation, orthography is ing, okay, and it's a suffix of some kind. It evokes this process, so this thing here, and okay, it's called P for now, whatever. And the profile of that process is the ongoing state. So now I've just found a silly little way to write down that when you hear ing, you see a picture like this, okay? And similarly, let's see. Oh, okay, well, I want to just flash back to these other pictures to remember that we're talking about sentences like, she read for an hour, she read the book for an hour, she read the book in an hour, right? The difference was there a whole book? What page was she on at the end? She read in an hour being strange. These can now suggest perhaps that the construction for and in, they're similar in some ways, they both require some amount of time, and they want to say some time measure, but they're different in some way. The picture is, maybe in the for one, there's no, so yeah, you can't read this, but it says no goal, right? So there's like she's reading or walking or doing whatever it is, she walked for an hour, all it says is a duration, right? Whereas this one, she read the book in an hour, it would have that there's a finishing condition that she's at the store, she walked to the store, something like that. So there's some difference in the graph, just about whether the goal has been achieved, is asserted to have been achieved, right? So the in, something has been achieved, right? That's the claim of what the difference is. So then, again, maybe you can predict that when you try to write this down for language, to sort of say what role, how do they differ, or what does for look like? Something about for is, there is a time period, okay, and I'm telling you how long it was. Okay, so again, this notation just says, I have this word for, and I have time period. So like 4 years, or for 2 minutes, or for an hour, right? That's something like that. They come in a certain order in English. The meaning is some interval with a duration that is specified, whatever this is, like that's some other, let someone else worry about that for now, and 5 years, whatever it is, this duration is set there. And I wrote here, TLIC is false, which means TLIC is a feature that just sort of says, is the goal, is there a completed goal, right? So the picture here is just, that there is a duration, but there's no twisting stuff. So again, there's little bits of notation that tell you the difference. And I won't show you the in one, but you can guess, okay, what's the difference? It's going to be something like true here, right? So they have structural similarities, but differences in what they actually expect. Okay, so a little mini summary of this section is that aspectual constraints and aspectual language, anything in language that tells you about the structured event, like, for example, the for and in constructions, they can do things like tell you whether a goal is achieved or not. And I didn't talk about these examples, I'll leave it, but just that as long as you have all the structure that we set up in the beginning and ways to talk about goals and duration, all this stuff, then you should be able to express how different pieces of language and different languages what they care about and what constraints they want. So we can talk about these other sentences if you like later. Too many, okay? And so for example, if the ongoing construction, right, the progressive requires some kind of interval that goes on for some time, you might need to iterate it, right? And you might need to do something to what you had. Like if I just said, I was sneezing for hours, very automatically you will guess that there's more than one sneeze. Okay, it's a process of multiple sneezing. Temporariness and reversibility, let's see if we'll talk about that in a second. So maybe we can come back to that in the discussion if we have time, but there are all these things that you can infer if you know that the construction expects it. Okay, so I just gave you two tiny little examples of aspectual constructions just to illustrate that a very simple sentence like Harry has been reading the book for 5 minutes actually involves a lot more. Okay, you need to know what Harry in the book, those constructions look like. You need to have some idea of reading and the idea that it's also progressive. We talked a little bit about that. The idea that progressive has a process, right? That's the one I showed, right? Okay, so at least you need to know, this basically this verb, and then the been reading construction, right? And then also the have X'd, has been reading, right? That's fitting on together, right? Is something about, is at the end of some process internally, right? So I'm just giving you a laundry list of basically these are jobs that somebody has to do, right? As a linguist, you need to analyze all this stuff. The tense that is has been reading instead of had been reading or will have been reading or something like that, right? And then the idea that you're reading a book that's transitive of some kind, right? So that the reading of the book is a thing as being read, it's a resource that's being consumed, all this stuff. And that the for X time, those are the bold ones we sort of talked about, that it says how much time. So this is just one little list, and if you had other sentences that are very similar to this, you might have to worry about frames and metaphors and modes, lots of other things that you could have to do. But the approach here is that all of these, if you have sufficiently rich semantics underneath, they can be written as these pairings, these mappings, from something about what the language that you use, the forms, and this sort of rich structure underneath. And then from there, you can sort of go wild. You have the world is at your feet. You can sort of express all these different things and draw lots of inferences. That's the hope. So now this is absolutely not all the way completed, but there's a lot of work to let's say, render that true. That is completed. Okay, so this is the slightly less cartoony version of what we said. That in order to understand a sentence, you might require both the embodied schemas, right? So we said what those were, these frame-like things, and then these constructions, these mapping things. And so both of these are knowledge of language includes at least that. And I'm not even showing that, yes, and you need to know who the Pope is, and you need to know where you're sitting, and all these other contextual pragmatics, right? So that's all assumed too. And that when you get an utterance in a situation, what you come out with is potentially partial, but you get some interpretation, and then I didn't draw the lower version, ran out of space, but then you can run the actual dynamic simulation that says, okay, I'm running now, and I need energy, and all that stuff. And this blue arrow, sort of, it's like this black box, but bluer and more arrowy, that is sort of standing for a parser, that there is some process that you have to go through. And so there's been work, actually, yes, there's been a series of work, a series of models expressing how you would actually take bits of stuff written down the way we saw it, and come out with something that could actually tell you what simulations you're running. Okay, so this is all supporting a larger model of how you understand sentences. Okay, so this is end of part 2 here. Take a breath. So any questions so far? We sort of talked about what the underlying semantics looks like, and then now what the sort of the meat of the mechanisms for getting from sentence to simulation. And now, okay, we'll move on. Okay, so the larger picture. When you want to build a theory of language, what does that mean? Well, you need to know something about what you think the language looks like. What is the structure of language? The claim is also you would want to know how it's used. It's not just language in the abstract, it's used for comprehension, production, you do stuff with it. And then you have to learn it somehow, right? So these things, you want to, so someday, together we should be able to do this. Okay, and so in this talk so far, I've tried to give a sketch a little bit just now of the particular form of construction grammar, embodied construction grammar that we use, but the important thing is constructions have to be there somehow. That's somehow your theory of language structure. And oops, yes, okay. And so the only thing I would say here is having made a rich underlying representation for events and actions, you can actually maybe say, hey, if you want to use the word universal and throw that around, maybe this is a good candidate. I mean, there might be other things as well, but at least we all have, in all languages, there are people with, you know, this similar biology anyway, similar sensory motor, similar emotional things. Okay, Michael can talk about that tomorrow. And that if we have a representation that captures the kinds of things we experience as humans, then maybe those rich features will be the kinds of things that actually show up in grammar across languages. Okay, so doing typological study, I mean, we've done somewhat more than that, but there have been sort of more detailed, a little bit more detailed work at these. But I think that the kinds of things that we have been representing in the simulation-based model, so far, I haven't come across an aspectual construction in any language that defies representation in this way. It's sort of, they generally have some basis in experience. Okay, so then there's a little bit of an opportunity there to do typological work. And then the theory of language use is sort of what I talked about, both in terms of the underlying dynamic stuff, like, okay, I want to know, am I tired now, or am I at the store, or is there 1 sneeze or 5 sneezes? That's one kind of thing, as well as the process of getting from words and sounds and gestures, etc., to actual meaning and understanding. So the sort of add-on that I'll say is that you already got the idea, I think I said, that something like he was sneezing for 10 minutes, we have an explanation in this model for why you might now say that's more than 1 sneeze. But if I then turn around and say, oh, actually, I'm watching a film that's in slow motion, and I'm watching this, and it's taking a really long time, and he's opening his mouth, and it's going, and he hasn't yet finished sneezing, that would be totally a linguist response to, well, you could have this context, but the thing is that that's true, right? You can always think of a special context that will allow a new interpretation of a standard construction. So we don't want to ignore it for that reason, we want to explain it. So in this framework, we can explain it, or there is at least the potential for using this rich structure for saying, hey, we know that for 10 minutes, this duration wants a duration, something that really lasts that long. Where's an interval? Where's an interval? Sneezing, that's not an interval, that's perceived in human time as an instant. Okay, but if I say slow motion, oh, now everything in the time scale has changed, and it could well be an interval in this extremely boring movie, right? Okay, and I probably won't talk about this too much, but Srini Narayanan has worked out in great detail that you can use the same framework for explaining metaphor. So France fell into recession and Germany fell out, and so the falling and all these very, very embodied actions have inferences that go into other less grounded domains. He's been working on counterfactual, so there's lots of cool stuff you could do if you can actually talk about how things fit together in connected complex events and like potential multiple possible worlds of simulation, right? The counterfactuals, etc. Okay, and again, hinting at it that this idea that now you have the basis for why how you would deal with unexpected sentences, right? So here's just a list of maybe some things, right? You're going to be profile. Oh, so usually she has arrived isn't, let's say that it's not something that would be something that is a resultative. It's not something that has consequence, let's say. So the perfect tense usually is something that has consequence. She has climbed whatever Mount Fuji. She has arrived. Maybe there is actually an intention of expressing, okay, well now we can begin the lecture, right? Or she sneezed for an hour, many sneezes, she sneezes all the time. So there are various things that that you can explain the pattern of inferences. It's just a similar to what we've been saying all along. Okay, and this is actually, I think we've already been covering enough that the sneezing, you're looking for a sneeze, and so you turn it in, you transform this graph in some sense from 1 sneeze into many sneezes. Okay. So just to reinforce that, now we have a way of doing this stuff. Okay, I guess I'll come back to states. The comment there is, if I have a sentence like, I live in Texas versus I am living in Texas, the difference of maybe implying that it's temporary, could be something about the aim. You need some process that could end, Bill is being silly, so that's something very intentional, like he's trying to be silly, intending to be silly, and that's why it can be expressed in progressive tense. So the difference between I am a silly person and I am being a silly person fits if you basically allow coercion from the basic type of silliness into this more imposed requirement of a process. Okay. A little bit just that now you can also say, well, if we believe in this theory of embodiment, we really think that language, these sort of sentences about these things may influence how you actually may draw on your actual performance of the actions. There's been a lot of interesting work lately showing psycholinguistically that if you set up your experiment right, more or less, and you have people do things like answer a question that they don't know what the experiment is about, they answer a question by either pushing their hand forward, to do something, or pulling back, it might influence language about direction. And similarly, if you have them do something that is, while they're performing an action, the progressive sentence about hand motion facilitate manual action in the same direction. So basically, if they're talking about something, it might make them faster response. So these kinds of psycholinguistic experiments have been happening, and that perhaps perfect sentences don't have this effect. So maybe you have this effect when you're talking about progressive sentence because you're in the middle of performing the action, so it's more tapping into the basic schema involved than the perfect sentence, which is sort of viewing it from a distance. Okay, so there's a little two phrases there. Okay, so the last bit here, we're good on time? Okay, the last little bit here, you might see this, the last box, is the theory of language acquisition. And I will definitely not give you the whole story here, but you might think of it as, if you know what the representation is, maybe that's actually a good idea for what kids have as part of their input, right? That they are experienced in actions and interactions in their context more earlier than they're experienced with the forms of their language. So again, the idea that these are candidate universals for the kinds of things that are picked up on by human learners. This is part of what we were saying before, and that these are good kinds of constraints on acquisition, right? Like maybe the things that are easy to learn are the ones that appear in this kind of structure, right? Like the fact that you care, how, whether you're in the process of doing something or whether it's done, that shows up a lot. So, and for particular actions, it may be that some are more salient than others. So kids say like fell down a lot more than fall, because I think they're often told, oh, you fell down, that kind of thing. So things that are salient will become part of their initially learned constructions, and later on sort of more abstract grammar. So I don't know how much to say about this, but you can definitely then say, what are the kinds of things that are likely to happen over the course of a child's acquisition? Which things are going to be learned first? Which things are more complex? The structure, if it taps into a very complex, like the one we saw with, has been continuing to go on this thing, that obviously isn't the first thing that comes out of most kids' mouths. They usually start with, eating or falling or something like that. Okay, and so maybe if we want to think about what children are getting, these are the kinds of things that are important to them. So the picture here is an add-on to what we said before. Like, you could imagine you're in the situation and you're understanding, and in fact, you're a poor kid who just doesn't have very much language yet, so you only have a partial interpretation. So then you have to go through some process where you're saying here that you look at the situation and you learn new stuff, more or less. And so there's let's say, a thesis worth of stuff explaining this in more detail. But for aspect, the idea is that if you don't have the right kinds of representations coming in, then it's very unlikely you're going to have the right kinds of representations coming out. Okay, so here's the summary now, is just that this account, which is inspired by simulation, the idea of action and motor control and perception, we think that not only does it provide a nice representation, right, to allow you to explain both the acquisition, the use, and the structure of language, but actually it gives you a nice way to talk about phenomena across languages, and it's sort of, even if you were just focusing on what distinctions you care about, it sort of has a nice way of, you could translate all the theories that you like from traditional aspectual studies and say, oh, now I can actually say exactly what I mean. When I say I care about boundedness, or I care about imperfective, or whatever, there should be, let's say, an underlying representation that can make that explicit, and this allows you to do that, I think. So it's not that it's incompatible with these other analyses, it just makes it richer, and it makes you able to deal with, let's say, a larger scope of phenomena. Okay, and then there's much more work to be done, for sure, and like across languages and across phenomena, but I think that this suggests it's a good candidate for a scaffold for layering things on. So I hope that it turns out that this is sufficient, but at least it motivates your analyses in a way that that simpler and less rich representations couldn't do. Okay, and this will hopefully be very useful for both child and natural and artificial learners because these problems are very hard. Okay, so now I guess you should be able to interpret this graph. So thank you very much for being such a lovely audience. And now I have a seat.
Thank you.